My name is Michael Washburn. I'm the Interim Director of Public Programs here at the Graduate Center. And on behalf of the Graduate Center community, I'd like to welcome you to what promises to be an illuminating evening. This is this semester's final keynote event in the Graduate Center's year-long exploration of the creative economy. As many of you know, the Graduate Center is a school of arts and sciences, a center for applied and theoretical research, and a platform for performance, conversation, and public debate. As a community of students and scholars committed to the idea that learning is a public good, we regularly offer public programs featuring eminent thinkers, cultural leaders, and distinguished artists addressing some of today's most pressing issues. To that end, we've been delighted to present Cultural Capital, the promise and price of New York's creative economy, which has been an institution-wide public programming initiative that's been exploring the city's creative and knowledge-based industries through an array of conversations, panel discussions, screenings, and performances. There are 3 more events in the series. You can get the pale green propaganda pamphlet out from the table when you leave. There will be a conversation on the fashion industry featuring several designers as well as Valerie Steele from the FIT Museum, Stella Bugbee from New York Magazine, and the Graduate Center's own Eugenia Policelli. And then a conversation on technological innovation with some representatives from Microsoft, Google, I'm drawing a blank on the third, and moderated by the GC's own Bill Bialik. And then finally, there will be a conversation on creative placemaking featuring Jamie Bennett and Rip Rapson, formerly of the NEA and from the Kresge Foundation. So if you're interested in those, please pick up information. It's been a quite informative and engaging series. We also have all the events on YouTube on the GC's webpage or channel there if you want to check those out. So as I was saying, from music and publishing to arts organizations and tech startups, New York has long been vital to the creation and consolidation of the creative economy. And through this academic year, we've been exploring these fields as well as many others. And tonight, as we draw this series to a close, we're going to talk about the interweaving, the interconnections between curatorial work, technology, museums, the arts. I'll be very brief. I'm delighted to introduce Lev Manovich, right there. He'll be moderating tonight's discussion. Lev is a professor of digital humanities and computer science here at the Graduate Center. He's also a director of the Software Studies Initiative, which works on the analysis and visualization of big cultural data. Lev's the author of Software Takes Command, Soft Cinema, Navigating the Database, and the Language of New Media, which was described as the most suggestive and broad-ranging media history since Marshall McLuhan. And last year, he appeared on the list of 25 people shaping the future of design. I forget who he is nestled between. More bit of housekeeping. Toward the end of the conversation, we'll open the floor up for questions. There are microphones on either end of the audience. If you please queue up for those so we can capture your incisive questions for posterity, but also so that your fellow audience members can hear the question. Thanks a lot. Lev Manovich.
Thank you so much for coming. So we're going to have 3 amazing speakers who are definitely world leaders in both thinking about and implementing use of new technologies in museums in a variety of ways. As we'll tell you, I was going to start with a 3-minute introduction, but let me try to restart the computer, see what happens. While it's restarting, let me very briefly introduce the speakers. Since Michael already started this whole idea of mentioning with people on different lists, all our speakers are also on the lists, more important than mine. So our first speaker will be Seb Chan, Sebastian, full name. So I noticed 2 of our speakers out of 3 have this aliases, very good for Twitter. So Sebastian is Seb, and Sreenav is Sree, and Paola, Paola is just Paola, right? Like Jesus Christ, you can't make it any shorter. Okay, I think booting up. So I'll briefly introduce the speakers, then I'll give my 7 to 8 minute introduction, and then each speaker will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have some amazing controversial debates helped by your provocative questions. So if you like this description, then please stick around and make it happen. So Sebastian is the Director of Digital Emerging Media at Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum. He is truly, I think, a leader in the international design and technology museum community. Before coming to New York and Cooper-Hewitt, he was a Director of Digital Strategies and Powerhouse in Sydney, and under his leadership, Powerhouse was the first museum which in a very ancient period of 2006 brought a big part of its collection online, and that's even before some was born and before the term digital media, right, appeared, so he's truly a pioneer. Next, Sree is currently Chief Digital Officer in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and also a technology journalist. Before coming recently to Metropolitan, he was teaching journalism at Columbia and also writing widely about digital media topics, and he is on lots of lists which he asked me not to mention, but it's very tempting. Okay, Paola is also on the list as one of the 100 most powerful people in the world of art. She's a senior curator in the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA, and also director of MoMA's R&D department. Well, let me just use this opportunity to say that she's one of the few people who actually shaped my whole professional life, because I think she came to New York, about 20 years ago or so, and she curated a number of amazing exhibitions at MoMA, which brought kind of design, right, in the center of museum culture in New York, and also she explored in lots of different ways, as she will tell you, I hope, lots of ways in which the term new media can be understood in museum context. So before giving the floor to these amazing speakers, let me just throw some more slides on you, just to expand your thinking about what these two terms, new media and museum, mean. So I think new media can be thought of in a very narrow sense as describing a particular cultural period, let's say between 1990 and maybe 2005, when the new emerging kind of cultural forms related to computers, right, entered the scene. So things about like World Wide Web, 1993, first Mosaic browser, CD-ROMs, first CD-ROMs published by museums like the Louvre, and then the complete adoption of digital technology by general public in the early 2000s. So that's a very narrow definition. I'd like to expand it and to suggest that we can also think of new media as any kind of new technology, right? Let's say beginning at least 200 years ago, and of course we can go even further to a printing press, but let's say we begin with photography, and how these technologies were entering, influencing, and shaping museums and museum culture for over 200 years. I think it can be an amazing book which is waiting to be written. So in this, understood in this more expanded sense, new media would refer to things like photography, film, concrete, glass, audio guides, computers, Google Glass, right? So it's a variety of technologies related to media capture, media display, and computation networking, which museums had to adopt, exhibit, respond to during the whole modern period. Okay. So what I want to do is just briefly give you sort of a set of what I think are different dimensions, right, of this dialogue, some of ways in which new media has entered museums during this time. So new media can be used to enhance visitors' experiences. Of course, the first slide has to be by my fellow Russian, Eli Sitsky. So this is a famous, I call this first interactive museum installation. So it's abstract room he designed in Hanover in 1927, where he put paintings behind these boards, right? So you see like each was painting, there's another painting behind, and you have to literally take this board by the handles and move it up and down or left to right or rotate. So it's amazing kind of precursor to interactivity almost 100 years later, which we still now beginning to see in museums. And then this is the first audio guide from 1952 in Sloterdijk Museum in Amsterdam. And then this is from, last 2 years, an amazing Gallery 1 in Cleveland, designed by the leading company in this field called Local Projects. And I will just throw in, although it's not a museum project per se, a work which done by my lab this year called Safety City, where we designed an interactive interface which allows web visitors to filter and sort and navigate through a database of 3,200 selfies. And you can see both images and graphs at the same time, so we're hoping to be able to adapt this kind of interface to art and museum collections. Now, we can also, of course, use new media to design museums. In this case, new media stands for computer graphics and computer animation and CAD programs. Of course, we have to show at least one slide of the place which started it all, for better or for worse, the Bilbao thing, and then this is more recently, I love it actually, actually one of my favorite new museums by Zaha Hadid, a Museum of 21st Century Art in Rome, also designed with the help of software, responsible for these graceful curves. Now, more recently, people started to capture the data about visitors and museums and use it to study patterns. So museums are now participating in the whole shift towards the use of data and big data to understand human behavior and human cultural patterns in new ways. And this is just one of dozens of papers. This one called Visualization and Analysis of Visiting Styles in the 3D Virtual Museums, right? And here are visualizations, a kind of heat map which shows you how people navigate for a particular exhibit and the areas where we spend more time. And now these kind of maps are produced in real museums as well. Now, another aspect of this relationship is showing new media in museums. And I think we can go back to 19th century or 20th century, because as I said, new media doesn't start with computers. So this is also from our ongoing project with MoMA, with our photography department. So we got access to, I'm not sure the whole thing, but a pretty big part of our photo collection, over 20,000 photographs. And this is just a visualization which shows you kind of volumes of how many photos we have for different periods. And if you zoom in, right, you actually see the photographs. So you can see a big spike around 1930s, even a small spike around 1970s. So this is both to talk about, for example, how new media has been entering museums. I think MoMA has been the first museum, or probably one of the first museums, probably the first one to start collecting photography in the early 30s. And now, of course, we can use new media to actually understand the history of this collection. And there are also some very important historical precedents. As we know, in the 1960s, museums were in certain sense, until Paula showed up, right? But in the 1960s, museums were in a certain sense more open to experiments with new media. So this, of course, is a poster or catalog for famous exhibition software, information technology, its new meaning for art, which was in Jewish Museum in New York in 1970. And this is from the same exhibition. I love it. This is 1970, right? 30, how many years ago? 44 years ago. Life in a computerized environment. Okay, so if you Google glasses. And then, of course, we have in the 90s development of specialized museums for new media art, such as Arts Electronica Center in Linz. We can also think about, again, kind of starting with, right, just using new media to make museums better, and slowly maybe going towards more and more radical ideas. We can think about alternative museum platforms. So, of course, Duchamp, right, reducing his collection to a kind of suitcase, how people now talk about you can put Library of Congress, right, on your iPad. Well, he was already kind of doing it, right, reducing his whole career to one suitcase in the 1920s. And more recently, we have online museums, right, such as Google Art Project. And finally, just a few more slides about what I think is the most important topic when we talk about technology. Technology is not really interesting or useful by itself. It breaks over time, and whenever you get a new phone, it's going to be obsolete 3 months from now. The best thing about technology is that it can help us challenge our conventional ideas about what things are, how do we describe styles, what museum is, what is the catalog, what is an artist. So here are maybe a few little provocations about what is a museum. Not all these ideas are being shaped by technology, but some of them are. So I think ultimately, to me, right, the best thing which can come out from this discussion about new media and museum, we kind of know what new media is, but maybe we have to unlearn, we have to forget what we think museum is. So, right, again, 70s, perhaps more radical time, and today, in certain respects, Centre Pompidou, a museum which is architecture trying to respond to a new kind of technological environment, right, the new idea of technological future, both embrace it and critique it. And then, of course, our own time, right, so I'm living next to High Line in Chelsea, and this is the new building for Whitney Museum, which will be open next year. So if you can compare, right, I'm not going to make any comments, right? So that's how it's going to look. And then, just to give you something else, normally, right, when you buy technology, right, I'm going to get my new Samsung phone tomorrow because I just can't get any reception on my iPhone 4 with AT&T. Oh, sorry, nobody. Okay, I wasn't endorsed by Samsung or Apple. I'm just complaining. How New York is supposed to complain. So usually it's shiny, right? And then it breaks, but you're not really, and then it goes to some place in China nobody can see. But in museums, when you also go, usually things are kind of, when you put technology, it's also kind of shiny, it usually works. Well, it doesn't have to be. So my last slide is a kind of diorama from Museum of Space Exploration in St. Petersburg. And obviously, these cosmonauts are not real, but I think this part of a spaceship is real, and this is what happens when things come back to Earth. New media is no longer new, it's kind of dirty, right? It's kind of corrupted, it's kind of old. So I think this is maybe a wonderful point to stop. Thank you so much. Our first speaker will be Seb Chan. Welcome, Seb.
So hi, my name's Seb. I'm at the Cooper-Hewitt, the Smithsonian Design Museum. Formerly, I was at a large science museum in Australia, the Powerhouse Museum. And I've also done a lot of work with libraries and other types of cultural heritage organisation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about experiences here, where I am now at the Cooper-Hewitt, but also looking back to some of the things that I've done in the past and done with others in the past. Because I think we're at a moment now where museums are embracing digital in quotes, but they're very narrow in what they think it is. Digital shouldn't be. This should not be newsworthy. Your new Twitter account is not newsworthy. Your new video series isn't. Your new website isn't. And I'm actually launching a new website soon, but these are not digital. It is not your new gallery kiosk, and it is certainly not your new app. In many ways, we've retreated from the promise of the web. And the web has itself become, very, very balkanized in the last few years. But it is sad to see museums, particularly public museums, retreating from the promise the web gave us initially. We have, in essence, retreated from scale. Digital should enable us to do new things, new forms of scholarship, new forms of engaging the public, new forms of exhibit. Lev kind of pointed to many precursors to this. It should enable us to collect the present, the present, which is media and particularly digital media. And it should, as Lev pointed out, create a new sort of museum, which is, of course, a negotiation with our publics. As designer Anab kind of Jane writes, we're in this period of super density, dystopia and chaos. This is now the new normal, and we need to adjust to what that new normal is. For a long time in museums, when I work with museums and libraries I'm in a consulting role, I talk a lot about the tensions and mapping these. Are museums primarily for families now or scholars? Exhibits or collections? Are museums about buildings into galleries, or are they a form of platform and media? Should museums and their education focuses be about their curriculum in this world of STEM and kind of STEAM, or about free choice learning? Are physical museum and digital museums about experience or about fact? And we know that the public is beginning to change. This is a slide from AAM's research, the American Association of Museums, from a few years ago. America has changed. The audiences that typically visit museums today are not the audiences that represent America in the kind of future, or let alone now. At the same kind of time, virtual tours, the essential virtual museum experience of 15 years ago has effectively been privatized by kind of Google, which is an exciting development because they have scale. But we have, as a sector, retreated from doing this ourselves. At the same kind of time, this idea that is very old has become something that is incredibly affordable. Should we be designing our physical spaces to be roamed by robots and robot eyes? What does it mean to design a physical museum that doesn't have stairs, so robots can wheel around these spaces when our physical spaces are closed? What does it mean when our collection? These actually are now $1,000 kind of dollars. These were, when I was doing some initial work in Australia with this sort of gear, $20,000 a robot 4 years ago. It's now $1,000. Also, we're starting to see really exciting art projects that are taking collections and bringing cities to kind of life. This is a UK project that gets people to engage with their cities and tell stories about their kind of cities using SMS. Very simple tech, but very effective. You'll see here that you text a message about a thing, and then it will reply to you and get you to engage with what you can see behind you here. Which is a lot of fun. We're also seeing many museums now engaging with 3D scanning and 3D printing. The Met, I'm sure Sree will talk about some of the 3D work they've also been kind of doing. This is also the kind of new normal now. This is not exceptional. 3D printing's been around for quite a while now, but this is becoming the thing that the public is beginning to expect. My favourite museum in Australia, actually the world, is this museum in Tasmania, a tiny state off the southern point of Australia. This museum gets half a million visitors a year. It's private. It has no kind of labels at all. It's an art museum with no kind of labels. And you get one of these. And what's exciting about this is that it enables you to get at the end of it a personalised visit report, as well as feeding back data to the museum itself about the things visitors do within it. And you can see also in the new MoMA guides now that the MoMA guide gives kind of you a personalised visitor report too. This is now the new normal. So Cooper-Hewitt, we're one of 19 Smithsonian museums. We're located a little bit north of the tourist wall, which seems to be the Guggenheim. People have run out of energy. They've visited the Met, they've visited the Guggenheim. Their legs are tired and their wallets are starved. So we're going through, as you perhaps know, a minor kind of sort of renovation. And we will reopen at a point soon to be announced. And interestingly for us, this closure has given us the chance to rethink what a designed museum could be. Are we a museum of art, or are we a science museum, or are perhaps we a place between those kind of two? Could a designed museum sit between these kind of two and draw attention to the processes, the choices, and the human decisions in kind of the making of things, rather than the finished piece itself? Cooper-Hewitt has a long past in this. The Cooper-Hewitt collection's always been a working collection. This is it at Cooper Union many years ago. And what's interesting about this was the collection was seen. This is Eleanor Hewitt's comment from 1919. She privileged the use of the collection above the preservation of the collection. This was a very forward-thinking view, and perhaps now with digital, we can both enable use and preserve at the same time. The museum's collection has grown and diversified, so we have great graphic kind of design, textiles and drawings, a collection of bird cages, product design, more wallpapers, some quite amazing decorative artworks that really need video to show their kind of details and the way they work. Things you couldn't see in the galleries themselves because of their scale, but also their sort of fragility. We have a collection of buttons, and of course cricket cages were quite a thing for your pets. And of course the spanking cat, which is the mascot for my team, a super important thing, of course. And what this forces us to kind of do as a museum is to revel in our past and the quirks of our kind of collection. We have a pretty large collection, and even with our renovation, a very small amount of it actually fits in the gallery. So we need to use digital means to get that collection out to the world. We're in the middle of a mass kind of digitization project, so that 10% photographed will grow in the next few kind of years to almost all our collection. But for the most part, museum collections are a little bit like this. This is in fact an Amazon warehouse, and the time will soon come where Amazon may provide the best kind of documentation of material culture simply because it could buy one of everything and potentially show it and ship it kind of to your house. Digitization is, of course, the first kind of step. The things that people ask for, photography is usually not enough for. Visitors ask, how is it made? Why was it made? Does it work? Why is it important? People want stories. They want to know about other people. Digitization, if we look back at this, metadata is the very bottom rung on this. 2D images, 3D images, maybe a rung up. Narrative and context is really what matters, and we're very far away from any point where any sense of museum knowledge is captured by these databases. That being said, when I started at Cooper-Hewitt, the Cooper-Hewitt became the first Smithsonian to release its metadata through a public domain license, just its metadata. So its metadata is now on GitHub, and we talk about this as cultural source code. This enables the museum and potentially museums as a whole to see themselves perhaps as a global seed bank of ideas. It makes possible data visualizations. This is a visualization of the object types in the museum's collection. And the Tate in the kind of UK did a similar data release, a public data release of their collection data. And Jim kind of Davenport, an amateur researcher, did this really nice visualization of the relative sizes of paintings in the Tate collection, and you can see the majority fit a 4:3 ratio. This begins to point at this idea of a porous collection, a collection that bleeds out to the kind of world, but also invites the kind of world in. Just over a year ago now, we launched our Beta Collection Explorer, an API to allow people to plug in. We've done a whole series of rapid prototyping and paper experiments within our Cooper-Hewitt labs. We've played with this idea of hand kind of drawn digitization, getting designers to draw the things that we have in our collection. We've played with ways robots might browse our collection. And we've come to terms, I hope, with this idea of wabi-sabi, that the kind of sort of perfect is okay. The museum's job is never done, and we need to be comfortable with that. We've looked at browsing tools that privilege proper browsing rather than search. Our color-based navigation for our collection is 10 times more used than our search interface, which shows that when people do not know what is in your collection, giving them browsing tools is far better than search interfaces. This is all about this challenge. Technology changes very fast, and in many ways, we are trying to build a house in the middle of a flowing sort of river. And this, at the end of the day, is about capacity building. This is about capacity building for the present, which enables new forms of curatorial practice too. Collecting 3D printed works not only as a finished work, but acquiring the source code for them too. Acquiring things like the iPod or the iPhone as things that work, not as static pieces. And to that end, we also acquired the first iOS app for the Smithsonian, which is this app called Planetary, which is a data visualization for kind of the iPad of a music collection and music player. Rather than collect this as a static app, we collected the source code for it, and we released that source code on GitHub as part of a preservation strategy for it. So you can actually download the app, but also the source code that the designers used to make that app. We didn't just collect the last version, but we collected all of the previous versions. So you can step back through that code and see all of the choices the designers made throughout its life. And you can also see the bug reports too, which are quite amusing. Open source perhaps as a preservation experiment for us. And of course, because we are a museum, we also printed out the code and put it on a shelf, just to be sure. In many ways, though, really collecting digital-born works is a Trojan horse. It's about creating change within an organisation. It's about forcing a change. Rather than waiting for the perfect digital preservation strategy, collecting digital-born works forces an organisation to adapt. It gets curatorial staff in other departments to think about what it might mean to collect graphic kind of design work, such as this Stefan Sagmeister book, as a series of source files as well as the book itself. It also asks us to think about product design, like the Nest thermostat that we collected on the right-hand side there. The Nest is a thermostat that reacts to the environment and records how it has changed through time. This is an interesting thing in its own right, but do we need to also collect a user's data set with that to make sense of that in the kind of future? In a world of sensors, should we be collecting sensor data to go with electronic works? If we collected Eric Fisher's maps of New York. This is locals versus tourists, which uses publicly available the geotagged photos to separate the photos taken by tourists in red from the photos taken by locals in blue, and you can see where all the tourists go. Should we also collect the raw data set used to generate this data visualization? As Trevor Owens writes from the Library of Congress, the future of all of this means that we need to be thinking about data dumps, images, logs, and data sets, very large kind of data sets, and collecting these. Libraries are very well set up for this. Museums have got to catch up. And we talk in the office a lot about whether museums become more like zookeepers, where we need to dress up as the specimens we try to preserve and help live in order to keep kind of them alive. This is a real photo, actually. Of course, the organisational structures we live in are built around 20th century publishing and exhibit models. Digital requires a new sort of structure that privileges other outcomes. These experiments, of course, are about shifting the museum's attention away from the past and towards engaging with the present and this new normal. Thanks a lot.
Folks, having seen Seb present before, I once wondered, I hope I'll never have to present right after him, because he's got the best collection of spanking kittens and everything else that's going on. So now for something a little different, a little more traditional in a way, I'm going to talk about what the Met is doing with its digital media, and reflect a little bit about my own journey. I was at Columbia for more than 20 years in the digital media department at Columbia Journalism School. And a lot of the conversations that I see in the world of museums and the arts and culture we've had in journalism for many years. What is the future of museums is something that people always talk about, and you can imagine this is a conversation that the new media, the world of journalism has been having for more than 15 years. And I think that there are lots of parallels, and I'll talk about those a little bit as well. I think there's been some confusion over what the hashtag is for today, but Seb decided that it's going to be LevTech. So it's #LevTech if you want to participate. And also, Lev did not give Paula's Twitter handle, which is so good that you will want to follow her. It is Curious Octopus, so you, at Curious Octopus. So you will want to check out her feed. I wanted to start, as Seb did, with an image of Fifth Avenue, but this is an image of the Met you may not have seen before, and this is part of our collection of photography at the Met. I figure if you're going to be talking about museums, we should show you lots of art, and I will try to slip in some slides of art while we're talking. People ask what a chief digital officer does at a museum, and I work with a world-class team on video, interactive, apps, mobile, geolocation, social, etc. And I think a lot of the things that you heard already from Seb and Lev are things that a place like the Met is thinking about and is actively involved in, but we're not always able to showcase or do things because we want to be very careful in the way that we bring along the institution. And that's one of the things that I'm getting to play with at the Met, is how do we take the kind of more exciting things that we might do without stepping on more traditional things that we might do. I also like to say that a chief digital officer is a chief listening officer, so my job is to work with folks across the museum to see how we can use technology in smart ways. If you're going to be a chief listening officer, it's a whole lot of listening. We have, as you know, millions of visitors in person in our physical space, but we also have lots of online visitors. And what we're trying to do is to connect the physical and the digital, the online and that in-person experience, and trying to do that is the fun that we get to have. We'll take a quick art break and go back to 1919 with a view of the Great Hall and the Grand Staircase, and that's a Rodin that was positioned there. And one of the things that I like to talk about when we look at social media is the importance of archival material. And I'd love to see more institutions posting pictures from archives. I think a lot of stuff is posted around what's happening now, but the archival pictures work very well. And all these pictures of art that I'll be showing you are from our Instagram collection, and our Instagram feed has just been, is nominated for a Webby, and we're hoping that we have a shot at that. The way I look at it, you know, museums have to be more about storytelling. And we have these hundreds of thousands of objects. Are we able to tell a story around each one, and how might we do that? Some of you may have seen this series that we do called 82nd and 5th, which is about looks at 2 minutes of per art with one curator talking about one piece of art. And I'll just play one I like to call the iPhone of ancient Rome. And this is Chris Lightfoot, the curator, talking about this piece of art.
When one thinks of the Roman world, one tends to think of architecture and sculpture and the impressive ruins of the Roman Empire. But it's the smaller objects that really speak to you directly as an individual, as a person. These are the things that they had in their daily lives. The ancient Greeks, of course, are well known for their drinking parties, but the Romans enjoyed dinners The Emperor Nero, for example, even had a servant whose only job was to write invitations to dinner parties. This spoon and fork combination would have been used at a well-to-do dinner party. And as a gadget, it clearly was meant to impress. It's like pulling out your latest handheld device in the modern world. It's also a very practical invention for the Romans. They didn't sit at a table. They reclined on dining couches, and so they would be supporting themselves probably with one arm, which meant that they only had one hand free to serve.
You get the idea, a very practical device. My iPhone won't last more than 2 years. Imagine something that's lasting thousands of years. But this idea of can we take every object and tell a story around it is something that we're exploring, and I think that that's an effective way of trying to bring the collection alive. Here we had our roof garden commission last spring, was Imran Qureshi, and he did this piece of art on our roof. And one of the things that he did when he talked about with the art was that this originally, the paint was to go all the way to the end, as you see here, but he stopped. And the reason he stopped was he was working on this when the Boston bombing happened, the marathon bombing. And he decided that it made sense to kind of curtail the art right at that spot. It reminded him kind of like the finishing line where the bombing happened. So you'll find there are very interesting ways in which we can tell stories that may not be always obvious, and there's ways to get people interested and connect them with the art that you're dealing with. I think that museums will, as they grow, will have to be more savvy about mobile than they have been, and to imagine a world where many more people are on mobile phones and how people will interact with them. I just saw a note today that Americans, more than half of Americans aged above 55 now have a smartphone. And that's not just a cell phone, but a smartphone. So that tells you that the kinds of folks who are going to be able to get and use your collection and explore your museum using mobile is just going to continue to grow. Here's something else from our Instagram feed this is a Degas from 1877. You already heard from Lev the importance of data as well as from Seb, and that's something that I think museums have in the past been really good about collecting data because things like admissions numbers, but what can you do with the data that you collect and what kind of data are you collecting is something that I think all museums are exploring, and we're also doing that at the Met. One of the things that I think you will see that a lot of buzz around the effort at the Dallas Museum of Art, where their Friends program and what they're doing with data in return for membership, seeing how that's a way to engage with your with the folks that are working with your museum. Here's something from our Petrie European Sculpture Court. Museums also have to be smarter about social media. It's something that we explore at the Met. We have several channels, and we have been doing these in a very systematic way. We only had Facebook, and then we launched Twitter and Pinterest, and this is over a 7-year period that we've got these to these various networks. And what we have said is that we don't have to be first on any of these, but what we want to do is join them when it makes sense. So as you look at this, one of the things we decided is that there's a network missing on here. And that's the network known in China as Weibo, spelt Weibo, W-E-I-B-O, because in China, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook are all blocked. So we wanted to reach out to our audience in China, and the way to do that is to have a Weibo account. But we don't, in the digital media department, have the resources to run a full Weibo account on our own, but we reached out to our Asian art department, and they've been working with us to do the posting. So just on a pilot basis, and by the way, you can get a lot done in an institution if you call something a pilot project. We've done about 40 posts on there, and we've had more than 1 million views of those 40 posts. And that tells you what the appetite for this kind of material is in China. But it's also not all just Chinese art. When we first started doing this, I figured all the interest will be in Chinese art in the Met collection, and of course we do a lot of that. But some of our most popular posts have been, in fact, non-Chinese art that they're interested in. And so we're exploring how to work that and how to make that happen. Of course, we have to remember that almost everyone will miss almost everything you do on social media, which means that as an institution that wants to be more savvy about it, we have to think about posting and then what kind of content, on which platform, when does that make sense? And we've been experimenting with that. We have 2 full-time people doing social media at the Met, and my colleagues Taylor and Lucy do a wonderful job in making sure that things have the best chance of being seen. Of course, everyone will miss almost everything you do until you make a mistake. And what we are also, what we do is we're very careful and strategic about our postings. Doesn't mean that mistakes won't happen. But I encounter museums and other institutions that post so infrequently that every post is weighted with danger. And if you post only once in a while, then of course the chances of things going wrong are greatly increased. But if you can, we think about, post more often and see what happens. And if you make a mistake, correct it. But that's why you have to participate, and that's what my colleagues do. Always good to have a little bit of Van Gogh. And we have to, we want to talk about kind of the museums have to be more accessible. And to me, that means a couple of different ways of looking at it. One is working very closely with our education department to make sure that every part of the museum is accessible to folks with disabilities who want to engage with the museum, and we work a lot on that. But also accessibility globally. How do we make sure everybody can see what we're doing online and visit the museum online and hopefully one day in person? But to do that, we have to get more of this being seen and making sure that the data is accurate, the scholarship is as up to date as possible. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to do. This is one way we became more accessible is being open 7 days a week as well. And we have to be open to more experimentation. And as I said, piloting projects is a good way of doing things, but also to try projects and just see what happens. The Weibo is an example of that. We're also experimenting with glass. My colleague Neil Stimler, Neil, if you'll wave, he's at Neil Stimler and he's tweeting away, is wearing his glass now. If you haven't, some people hadn't seen this before, so if you would just stand, I don't know if you can see, that's what, he is not live broadcasting you or anything, but he's always happy to give a demo if you want to check out how he's using it. Thanks, Neil. So that's one example. Another is this project that I absolutely love that we call kind of recoloring the Temple of Dendor. You're familiar, I hope, with the temple in the museum, which looks like this. But that is not the original color of the temple. The original color was like this, sort of like Christmas. And what we did is working very closely with the curators in the Egyptian art department. We are experimenting to see what a digital projection could look like. And it is absolutely amazing to see this and to think about how much color there was. And so this is an example of where our media lab, working with the experts, the folks who really understand the art, that collaboration, and that's an example of that. Here's a prayer niche from our Islamic galleries. And I want to just echo what Seb was talking about earlier, that we should be trying to be more collaborative, not just within different departments in a museum, but among museums. And Seb was talking about how things have become privatized, and it'd be great if there were more collaborations. And part of that is, of course, releasing your data and things like that. But are there ways in which we can do more? And I'm sure there'll be ideas that come up during the Q&A. This is an image from our next Costume Institute exhibition with Charles James, who was a legendary designer. And then finally, I believe that more museums have to be more open to repurposing, redisplaying, and resurfacing. I keep talking to my colleagues about the importance of creating new content. But what about all this great content that we already have? How do we get that out there? How do we get it seen in more channels, in more platforms, and have it kind of spread throughout the world? That's what we want to do. And I'm hoping that we'll share some of those ideas in tonight's conversation. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Paola Antonelli, and it's so interesting because Seb and I could end each other's phrases, basically, because he talked about technology enabling us to collect the present, and I'm entitling my talk tonight, The Art of Our Time, because that was one of the mottos that the founding director of MoMA, Alfred Barr Jr., used to talk about the mission of the museum since the very start, and the very start was 1929. And it's interesting because technology is like air. It just pervades everything that we do at the museum. By itself, it doesn't have any museal value, but it's the enzyme and the soul of any object, of any form of communication. It really is the enzyme of today. When I think of the present and of the future, I think technology. That's because I'm a contemporary architecture and design curator. Curators that refer to the past see technology as it was to be. It's ever present and it's ever important. And of course, there's many ways to look at the presence of technology in a museum like MoMA. Seb was kind enough as to talk about our new guide for the museum, interactive, which we call Audio Plus. And that's probably one of the biggest technological achievements for MoMA in the past few years. But I will not talk about that tonight. I will talk more about how technology looks from the viewpoint of a curator. Tonight you could have invited here, actually Allegra Burnett is here, and she was running the department that was at the node of anything technological happening at MoMA. You could have invited the head of the education department. Our online courses are amazing. You could have invited Michelle Elligot from Archives, and she could have told you about how we are trying to put all of the archives online. To make a long story short, everything we do at the museum is pervaded by technology. Whether you want to call it new media or simply technology, it's there. It reminds me of a beautiful quote that I once heard about the Spanish style in LA architecture. It's always there, even though one talks about it only when it's really, really good or really, really bad, like the weather. Technology is an intrinsic part of what I do as a curator, and as Lev said, I just celebrated my 20th anniversary of arriving at MoMA. And I remember that the first memo, I had never seen a memo in my life. I'm Italian, so memos actually offended me tremendously, and I was going to cry in the bathroom every day at the beginning. But I remember the first memo that I wrote was a 1.5-page memo on why I needed a Macintosh as opposed to the IBM that they had given me. So it's really interesting, you know, that was the first gesture that I made. But one of my biggest technological forays was this. It all started here. Ladies and gentlemen, you see here the beginning of the MoMA website. It's 1995. I'm doing my very first show, Mutant Materials in Contemporary Design. I want to do a website. Nobody really knows what a website is, and nobody wants to take responsibility. Communications doesn't want to touch it. Marketing, publications, everybody's like, oh, we don't know. So I get a budget of $327. With which I pay for cab rides to the School of Visual Arts, where Adrienne Wurtzel, God bless her soul, taught me HTML. And what you see here is me coding the website that started the whole MoMA website. You know, this is it, and you see this. You know, these are the other pages. But you know what? It has the whole checklist of the first show. And there are people that still thank me for having put the checklist online, whether it's good, bad, you know, institutional wabi-sabi, you call it the way you want, it's there. So the internet is a way of archiving what we do and having it available. Just a few months later, the true initiator of new media at MoMA, Barbara London, had somebody else code her first website, which was relative to Video Spaces installation. So 1995 marks the beginning of the MoMA website, even though it was still called Electronic Project or Pilot Project. And it's only a year later that we started really incorporating technology as part of what we do and having a website. When it comes to technology in the collection, exhibitions are a great source of testing grounds and also of elements for the collection themselves. And there are many exhibitions that I worked on, and of course, as I mentioned to you before, it's like the air. Every exhibition was about technology. But the first exhibition that I think of really incorporating digital technology, because that's what we're talking about today, is WorkSpheres, which is an exhibition that I did in 2001. It was the end of the dot-com boom and the beginning of the dot-com bust. And you know, there were still these amazing new office spaces. You know, Herman Miller had started the Red Line, and all of these startups were like, you know, working on one leg and with digital antennas coming up the wazoo. There was this promise of being able to really work digitally, but nothing ever worked. You know, the wrong plug, you had to dial up the server and the server wouldn't pick up. So it was great promise and also great chaos. And at that time, we commissioned for this exhibition, WorkSpheres, some really great projects, some of which had to do with the digital. In particular, the MIT Media Lab and Joe Paradiso's team had designed a whole interface, and also, you know, IDEO out from California had designed this whole very spiritual cubicle with a ceiling that had these projected skies. So it was a way to really incorporate digital technology, but always as a means to an end. And the means to an end in the end was expanding our capabilities, in that case, capabilities of working. Another exhibition that gave us a lot of fodder for the collection and also for our experiments on new technology is Design in the Elastic Mind, which happened in 2008. It was an exhibition that tried to fuse together design and science without the membrane of technology in the middle. See, the interesting thing is that as designers and also as museum goers and as museum doers, we all would like technology to disappear. I find it really interesting that Nike disbanded its fuel band and wearable hardware division in the past few days. Why? Because frankly, all we want is to be able to put a little beauty mark here as opposed to wear a bracelet. And the same happens with everything else we do. Technology is extremely important, but it should be metabolized. It should not be oppressively present and physically obtrusive. So Design in the Elastic Mind was trying to make this fusion happen, and it gave us a lot of acquisitions, especially in visualization design and interfaces and interaction design. And then, of course, Talk to Me. Talk to Me was an exhibition that was all about the changed culture and the changed perception of the world that has been engendered by the digital revolution or evolution, if you want to call it. Just the fact that we expect objects to have a communication with us, whether they have digital interfaces or not. It's the, how do you call it, the spanking cat or anything, we expect them to do something for us. And some of the great acquisitions that came from Design in the Elastic Mind and from Talk to Me, they range from this powerful visualization by Laura Kurgan and her colleagues out of Columbia University that is about visualizing data that normally remains hidden in words in newspapers. In this particular case, it's the visualization relative to Brooklyn of more than 300 blocks of inner Brooklyn, where the government spends more than $1 million a year for each block to keep some of the inhabitants either in prison or in halfway houses. It's almost like a measure of entropy, of social entropy, of waste of finances. But you know, you can read it in the newspaper and it's gonna go through here and out the other way, even though you're gonna be outraged for a few minutes. But when manipulatively a designer makes it blood red over a black map of Brooklyn, it really stays with you forever. And it's a powerful visualization that really speaks to a much wider audience than the one we're used to. Another great acquisition, which we actually use all the time when we want to explain the power of open source to a part of the audience that might not know about open source yet, is the iWriter project. You probably all know about it. Very simply, cheap glasses, computer camera, and software that enables the reading of an eyeball movement, and that enables this graffiti writer from LA that's stuck in bed because of Lou Gehrig disease and he's completely paralyzed. It enables him to tag a building in downtown LA remotely using the technology, the eye-writing technology, and a laser tagging technology developed by this group of hackers, artists, and programmers that centered around iBeam, the institution here in New York. So it's about explaining that, yes, design can be generous. Yes, open source is about crowdsourcing and crowd wisdom. And yes, that code is also very important. I like it when technology enables us to really be more human than we were even before. I like it when it enables us to mourn, to be happy for somebody's birth, to get married in a new way, or even to speak with God. And these are two acquisitions that I really love from Talk to Me. You see one for Catholic nuns, and the other one is instead for Muslim, just believers. The one for Catholic nuns is this altarpiece-looking ticker tape that is connected to the BBC News and is actually employed in a convent, a monastery in northern England. It's really a monastery, so the nuns cannot go outside, and they only get some Vatican newspapers that I can tell you how reliable news they deliver. So the BBC News ticker tape enables the nuns to pray about something that's really happening in the world, and in their words, it keeps their prayers pertinent, which I find really quite beautiful. I also like the fact that the designers did not try to be all chrome and futuristic and Jetsonsy, but rather they tried to really fit in with the idea of an altar decor. It's very sensitive, and it's about really augmenting our sensitivity. And instead, the prayer mat has a compass that has a module, a compass module that enables it to light up when it's in the right direction with Mecca of Mecca. Now, of course, we all know where Mecca is. We don't need something to light up. But it's kind of a sense of, it's a hint of taming technology to under the weight of humanity. So it's really quite beautiful from that viewpoint. The interesting thing is that I was mentioning to you how technology has been part of what the museum did forever. And even today, when we are, as curators, working so much in the digital realm, we hark back to some examples that are truly from the past. This is 1934, the exhibition Machine Art, super famous, by Philip Johnson. He took all these pieces of machinery out of their casings and out of their hidden places and put them on white pedestals against white walls as if they were Brancusi sculptures. And all of a sudden, a new beauty is revealed, and a new paradigm for art and for life is displayed for everybody to see. Well, it's not very different from what Karen McCarthy did in 1990. Karen McCarthy was an associate curator at MoMA, and now she is the head of the curatorial staff. I'm always bad with titles, but at the Cooper-Hewitt, and she's a wonderful curator. And at that time, she did this beautiful exhibition called Information Art, where she displayed and then collected these diagrams that were plotted out by computer engineers. They were a way for them to check that all the circuits were well laid on the different microchips. So we collected the microchips and the diagrams. In a way, it goes without saying that the collection continued, and that what we collect today when we collect digital artifacts is not that different from what we did collect in 1934. I like to think about it that way. Instead of wood or steel, we collect code. And as Seb said, it's important to try and collect the code itself, just as we want the objects that we collect to be physical when they are physical. We started collecting interaction design probably in 2005. The first acquisition were the reactive books by John Maida, and then other collections range from interaction design like the Shadow Monsters by Phil Worthington, and beautiful musical interfaces. In this case, it's the Tenori On out of Japan. Great visualization design. Here you see some acquisitions that are from a few years ago. The beautiful interface from the One Laptop Per Child that was short-lived. It had been designed by Lisa Strausfeld and her team, and it was really groundbreaking because it was all based on the idea of group network, and social before social was actually a dimension that we lived in. And the other two visualizations are Martin Wattenberg and Fernanda Viegas. One is viewing how the computer plays chess with itself, and the other, which I'm sure many of you know, is the gorgeous wind map, which is available for all to see on the internet. It takes data that is public, available from the National Weather Center, and it shows in this beautiful visualization that almost looks like a wheat field, it shows how the winds are moving over the territory of the United States at any time. Displaying this kind of technology in a way to make it normal and to make it be understood by our audience is what we try to do in the exhibitions. And you see here one of the many collection installations. In particular, this one was about design that is dynamic over time, and it showed the reactive books by John Maida on the iMacs that it was supposed to be in. And the problem that we have sometimes with digital technology is the obsolescence of some of the hardware, but we'll get to it another time. That's a little too esoteric. Of course, we've been collecting 3D printing for a long time, but right now I'm sticking to digital. And interestingly, we started collecting fonts in the digital realm as opposed to the physical one. In a way, it's kind of simpler. If you want to collect a whole Helvetica font, you have to collect all the points, all the different styles, bold, non-bold, from 1 to 35, and every single letter, character is a block. And instead, with the digital, you get the code, and you can find every variation. And it's really interesting to also understand that the digital dimensions that we live in today have brought a new capacity of synthesis that we didn't know before. Of course, architecture and design is not the only department to acquire the digital. Quite the opposite. I have to say that once again, Barbara Landon is amongst those who started the whole process. And one of the most beautiful acquisitions that we made is the Steiji Furuhashi Lovers installation that is also falling prey and falling victim to the problem of the obsolescence of hardware. More recently, we also acquired this beautiful work by Feng Meng Bo, which is Long March Restart, which is a Maoist version of Super Mario in a way. And here it was installed at MoMA PS1, and it was actually playable. So you see, there's a lot that can be said about how curators approach new media, and also about how they are collected. In this case, Feng Meng Bo was collected as a work of performance and media art, and instead the video games that we collected in the Department of Architecture and Design, and you see a few of them here, were collected as interaction design. This is one of the most exciting things that, exciting consequences about being in a place like MoMA and starting to collect new media. You can also introduce new branches in the tree of design and in the tree of the collection. And video games are one of them. We acquired them as interaction design, and we went and tried to get emulations by all of the different designers. We tried to get the source code when we could. It's not always possible because video game companies are very, very jealous about the source code. It's almost like their recipe for Coca-Cola. They don't want to share it. But in some cases we were able to, and in some other cases we were able to get emulations by the designer themselves. We also collected massive multiplayer games, which is also an interesting experiment because you cannot really let people play them in the galleries. They're too long to be played. And so in that case, we had to also think of how to condense and encapsulate the games for the audiences at MoMA. In some cases, the games were much easier to collect and to display, especially when it was the case of indie games like Passage. Passage is a great game by Jason Rohrer. It lasts 5 minutes. You are born, you go through life, and you die in 5 minutes. You have to make choices. You can choose whether to take a partner in life, and in that case, life is much shorter but easier. And instead, if you're by yourself, it's a little sadder and longer. So it's like, you know, there are all these paradigms and philosophical moral questions to make, but it's really quite a great game. And indie games really are always fun. And this is, you know, the latest installation that you might see if you go to MoMA. It has my favorite game of all, which is Tempest. I don't know if anybody has ever played it, but it's vector graphic, and with that really simple graphic, graphics. It really gives you universes that you have never imagined, and several others. We also have Magnavox Odyssey, and in that case, Magnavox Odyssey is a pre-digital game, and the original inventor, Ralph Baer, did a whole emulation for us. In this case, Ben Fino-Radin and Kate Lewis and all of our colleagues in the digital conservation department are doing wonders. But interesting enough was to think about how to collect and why to collect the video games. And we had to envision criteria that had not been really played out and had not been written out before. So we started thinking, okay, if we collect video games and interaction design, we have to consider the way designers deal with space, the space in the digital dimension, the way they deal with time. What kind of time? Real time, a time that is internal to the game, and how does it evolve, and how does it stick with the individual? Because remember, the digital space is a space that we inhabit the way we inhabit the physical one. We inhabit it lonely sometimes, in groups, we come and go, we want to close it off, we want to have private spaces. So it's interesting to see how the architecture of the space is actually developed by the designers. Aesthetics, of course, are always important when it comes to an art museum, so we were thinking of that too. But more than anything, what distinguishes interaction design from all other types of design is the behavior. Of course, designers design our behavior also when we work with digital objects that are not necessarily video games or with physical ones. But in the case of video games, behavior is really the focus of the design part. And we also had to think of how to show the video games in the galleries, and we made the decision to show them together with physical objects without making that much of a distinction. But to make a long story short, the funniest thing that happened was the reaction of some art critics. When we announced the acquisition, we were kind of surprised by how many positive reactions we got. We were afraid that we would be crucified, especially in the blog, that we would get comments from outer space, and instead the comments were mostly positive. Only many complaints about not having included somebody's favorite game that we had never heard of, and also we had made a few kind of harsh choices regarding violence in video games, but otherwise everything good. Art critics, ooh, Jonathan Jones from The Guardian, sorry MoMA, video games are not art. And the refrain started, oh my God, Pac-Man next to Picasso and Van Gogh, always Van Gogh. And you know, the funny thing is that the argument was so not standing on its feet that I was not even hurt. I was just like cringing for the poor guy, but I didn't do anything. The Guardian itself did something. And other writers from The Guardian came up with, are video games art? The debate that shouldn't be. Yes, we agree. So it was really interesting. We were just like standing by and looking at what happened. So internally at The Guardian, there was a back and forth, and then John Maeda decided to write on Wired, unprompted, and just went all the way off. But it's really interesting because there's nothing you can do. It's a matter of belief in what art is and art isn't, and what video games are or aren't, but mostly it's a misunderstanding about the digital space. And you'll see it here in this great, it's one of my favorite, this was Leo Leibovitz that wrote in the New Republic, and you can't read it very well, so I'll read it for you, but it's about the usual thing, are video games art? And at the end it says, it's a fascinating debate, but the answer to above question, are video games art, is, to put bluntly, no. Video games aren't art because they are quite thoroughly something else. Wait, code. So you know what? Picasso is not art because it's something else, it's oil paint. And it made me think of this great slide, which is the foreign loans to the exhibition Cubism and Abstract Art in 1936 that were refused admission to the United States as works of art by customs inspectors. So there you go. It's really interesting because sometimes technology goes faster than the world, than mankind, and sometimes it takes a while to catch up. And here comes the acquisition that I'm possibly the proudest of, which is the @sign. The @sign to me condenses everything, the perplexity, the puzzlement, and also the kind of belief in the future that technology gives us, because it comes from the Middle Ages. It's retained the same meaning throughout the centuries. It went from being made by hand by monks to being the symbol of our digital presence and identity. It's really an amazing work that is also in the public domain. Therefore, it kind of entails the introduction of the shared economy, even in the world of museum collections. So it's just this great metaphor for everything that I would like technology to be. Nonchalant, elegant, part of everything we do, just a seamless dimension of our life. And I think the museums really can make that happen. You know, I am always reminded of the fact that John Giorno, that you see there in the middle, the poet and artist, is here with Allen Ginsberg and with Burroughs. He was the one that invented, in a way, the 900 numbers with his Dial-a-Poem in 1969. Artists and museums can really help. They cannot patent every new invention, but definitely they can push us forward a little bit. And one of the biggest situations that we find ourselves in today is the need to find a seamless link between the physical and the digital world. This is a beautiful slide that Kevin Slavin and Area Code used several years ago. You'll find that it's a little outdated because it has some technology that we haven't heard of in about 6 or 7 years, but it doesn't really matter. I like this fact of the sky and the land and the in-between that is here represented by a QR tag. But in truth, it is this in-between that is the one that is most interesting to us in museums. You know, when you see museum goers today, you see them using things this way and taking pictures in order to get a better and deeper understanding of objects. Some people are still outraged by that, but most of us have learned to understand that it is a way to really have the experience of a museum. And that's why a few years ago we started a MoMA R&D department that is about understanding all of these new aspects of going to museums. We're hoping that we will be able to, as Seb was advocating, find new ways to be museums and new ways of expressing ourselves. We've been organizing a few salons that refer to topics that are relevant to the outside world and also relevant to the museums, from what it means to be a curator to how do you measure culture, how do you give culture metrics so that politicians stop slashing budgets. You know, so very practical issues that relate to the survival of museums and also to technology, but without being obsessed by technology. Technology comes into play as, once again, the enzyme of today. It's been interesting to see how the debate has evolved, but even more interesting for us at MoMA and in R&D has been to see how some other colleagues are looking for ways to express themselves differently. We are all very proud, not only the curator Leah Dickerman, not only Allegra Burnett, but all of us at MoMA are very proud of what was decided for the Inventing Abstraction exhibition. Of course, it was a wonderful show from all viewpoints, old school, new school, but what I really loved was the social media map of abstraction that showed all of the connections between different artists and how some of them were true nodes that disseminated a new way of looking at the world and a new way of perceiving art and reality. It's a way to discover data and understanding realities that we were not being able to access before. Similarly, a project that we're running right now that we're also very proud of could not have happened offline. It's a debate about design and violence that we initiated last November, and which is based on individual objects that we handpicked together with Jamer Hunt, my co-curator out of Parsons, and Kate Carmody and Michelle Fisher. We've been working on it a lot. We're picking these objects that have an ambiguous relationship with violence. You see here the 3D printed gun disassembled or the digital attack map by Google. And you see here instead a more facetious insect army, but also visualization of the debt crisis that explains what CDOs are in a very narrative and visual way. Or you see here the poster child for the whole program. It really works when we explain it. To look at the upper corner right, those are green bullets that are currently being developed by the government of the United States and the US Army. They are lead-free, so they'll be safe for the environment, even though you'll be dead. So it's really interesting. This kind of ambiguity is what we're looking for, and we're hoping that it'll help us understand better the manifestations of violence in our society. The prompt was the Steven Pinker book about our society becoming less violent, and the desire, the goal is to use design to have a dialogue with our public, a dialogue that is online. For every post, we ask a really knowledgeable person to write a comment on the post. We've had, we've had posts by William Gibson, by Anne-Marie Slaughter. We've had all sorts of great writers help us. And also, we ask a question at the end that is meant to provoke a discussion. Sometimes we also do debates in the physical world. Just last week, we had an amazing debate that centered on the Serpentine Ramp, the redesign of the slaughterhouse by Temple Grandin. We had a pro and a con, and we had a motion that said design can allow us to humanely include animal products in our diet. I really incite you to go and take a look at the website and look at the comments for the Temple Grandin Serpentine Ramp. You'll be amazed, like I was amazed, by how the debate is heated and ongoing. Why? Because when you ask this kind of questions to your audience responds. And that's what I think that technology is enabling us, curators, educators, and museum people to do, to have a real dialogue about real issues using the means at our disposal that sometimes are old spoons from the Roman era. Museums are alive. They collect live beings, as Seb said before. Sometimes we have to dress up like pandas in order to deal with these live beings. Digital artifacts are alive. Old Roman spoons can be alive if you put them in context. And the new media is enabling us to have a contact with the world and with our audiences that was not possible before. Thank you very much. Anywhere? Oh, here? Thank you. Water.
So, I've been told that it's New York City and people can just last more than 2 hours. But, Mad Men hasn't started yet. The sun has set, so I think there's nothing for you to do but to listen to these amazing people, even though we're not dressed in panda's costume. So would you guys stay for 15 minutes or so? And I promise, we'll just keep it within ourselves very briefly, maybe see if people want to ask 1 or 2 questions each other, and then it's open for you. So I want to say, because we don't have much time for debates, if maybe you guys had amazing presentations and done so much, if you have some burning questions you want to ask each other. Or if not, we'll go to audience.
No.
Okay, let's go to audience. Please. People just saw, there's microphones, right?
Yes, please use the microphones.
Hi. So I just had a question about stemming from Sree's slide about accessibility. So you talked about 2 types of many accessibility, kind of talking about people with disabilities and then also making it accessible to people, in the broader world who don't have access to the physical museum. And I was just wondering, how do you think that technology can be used to introduce museums and introduce art to people who have normally been left out of the conversation? So, just kind of taking away, thinking about museums and people who are searching for museums online, that's one subset. But then what about people who aren't even thinking about museums, but that might, that kind of experience might change their lives? So.
Yeah, and I think that you've identified an important issue of how do we get people who aren't typical museum goers. What was it, Seb, what your slide showed? The number of minorities going to museums is falling dramatically. And so part of it, I think, is having museums participate in non-museum spaces. I think that one of the things we do with our social media is to make sure when it's appropriate, we talk about things that are going on around the world that are related to art so that somebody who's not following us might interact and see us. But I'm sure you have ideas, folks.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is to make everyone feel welcome in our physical spaces, once and to counter us in our digital spaces. Those slides from 2006-07 of the Powerhouse collection, rose our web traffic to the collection almost sixfold, bringing in hugely wider audiences to our collections. But they wanted to know things that we weren't willing to tell people about our collection and didn't have the resources to respond to. And part of the last little while, my work's been about trying to figure out how museums can not only make their things more accessible, but actually be responsive when those audiences actually come in and want to engage with us. If we invite people in, we have to welcome them. And in fact, often our buildings are not well designed to enable that. You know, Elaine Gurian talks about threshold fear. It was probably about 25 years ago, and our museum facades are not that welcoming. So initiatives like at MoMA are interesting because they do broaden that public face, physically and digitally.
If I may add something, it's interesting because I'm not sure the technology can do that much to expand audiences to include minorities. It can do some, but I think it's a bigger and more radical problem. I mean, with the R&D and myself and Alina Rezende, who's working on it with me, we have had one of the salons about museums as citizens, and we had amongst the speakers, there was Holly Block and Ann Pasternak and David van der Leer, and then Tom Finkelpearl, who's now become the culture commissioner. But in his role as the director of the Queen's Museum, he dropped art from the title, which, you know, you might find it manipulative, but I think it works to eliminate some barriers. He decided to kind of turn his back to Manhattan because he had enough to try and lure Manhattanites, and therefore really started working using languages and creating bridges between communities without bypassing completely the white audiences of Manhattan. I mean, interestingly, it's sometimes a matter of attitude, and once again, technology cannot be the only means. It has to be a deeper cultural change.
Well, I just want to add briefly, I mean, I think the kind of things each of this museum is doing, and also what Sree mentioned about your Instagram feed, I think museums kind of sharing images of recollections online, and in this way people can counter them, right, in spaces which are more normal to them, like your Instagram app. So I think that's, an important thing.
I'd like to ask Sree and Seb, have there ever been any pushback from traditionalists or longtime curators at museums saying that some of these bells and whistles or innovations are detracting from the object or detracting from the kind of stories that they feel should be told? And what are some of those things that have met with some resistance, and how have you dealt with that?
Sure. I've only been in the world of museums for about 8 months, so this is new to me. I think a lot of those battles may have been fought before I got there, but part of it is that in our digital media team, we don't push technology for technology's sake. We think there's something wonderful of having just the art and you're just interacting with it, standing in a gallery or sitting in a gallery. So maybe the others have more experience with this, but when I first came to the Met, someone said to me, you're not going to get 100 curators who want to do new stuff, and I said, we can't deal with 100 curators who want to do new things. All we need are a few people who want to try stuff, and that's been the easy part. So I think it also starts with the leadership. In our case, with Tom Campbell and Emily Rafferty, have been very clear that digital is something they want to invest in, and they have invested in. So I think it's much easier to get people to get in line when the top is on board.
Yeah, I've certainly found that sitting on the executive really helps, and it is that senior management shift. It's also about solving the internal staff needs. I think one of the things I learned from the years at the Powerhouse, where we did some pretty radical change with the collection and increased the access to the collection to the point that the fashion curator's phone didn't stop ringing at all, pretty much, and she had to turn her phone off. Because of all the public inquiries that we were just not staffed to in fact deal with. We turned that around to being a great opportunity for curatorial to reassert their relevance to the community at large, and to really come on to par with the education team at the Powerhouse in terms of their value to the organisation, which previously had been hidden behind the veil of academic publishing and exhibits. So that sort of sense of opening up and removing the veil was incredibly empowering for the curatorial staff and brought them a lot of wins within the organisation. Of course with challenge, but this is a change that all museums are now going kind of through, and it's about, I think, identifying and listening, as Sree said right up front, that the CDO role or a senior digital role is about listening to the challenges other staff have and then using digital tools to address those problems, but move the organisation forward beyond just marketing and comms. This is a structural shift, and that's really what it's about, and bringing as many people along as you can.
Thank you. Hi. There were several mentions of the attempts to connect the digital and the physical, but I was hoping you could actually elaborate on some specific examples of instances in which you feel that digital projects have led to increased visitorship at your museums. So
whilst my press people have left, I still can't reveal the exciting things we have coming, but we're explicitly addressing that with the reopening of the Cooper-Hewitt.
I don't know, Allegra, do you know? I think the metrics are so complicated. I mean,
right.
Once again, to know if a digital increases physical in terms of visitation is so hard. Have you ever been able to?
No, it's one of the things that we're working on to see
Yeah.
if we can quantify that, and that's hard.
Yeah, I can give you, if you want, an example of a project that to me was just amazing in how it connected digital and physical, but it's not a museum project. Are you interested? Yeah, it's not a museum project, and it's fun. It's kind of old, and it's kind of not particularly high-tech, but it's amazing. It's Area Code. Once again, it used to be a gaming company. Now, and then it was bought by Zynga, and now it doesn't exist anymore. But when we still were using clamshell phones, I remember this image of a Motorola phone. So it was a game that you would play, and there were these images in the West Village, so you could see the map of the West Village, and there were these two people. It was a game that looked a little bit like Pac-Man, but you were two little dots, and then there was this Papa Sandi, this skull that wanted to eat you. And the two dots were you and your friend, and you were real. Papa Sandi did not exist, but it was on the map and wanted to eat you. And you were terrified, and you were running for your life. You know, you have pictures of these people running, even though there was nothing that could ever really eat them or hurt them. So I like how our minds work. And sometimes the connection between the physical and the digital is really that. It's not about the digital part of the museum increasing visitation in the real museum. It's about creating a new hybrid space that hopefully will be able to, the word that we all hate, monetize one day. But right now we don't know. It's a space for experimentation.
One of the things that we've done is we've added hashtags to the wall text, the intro wall text, for our exhibitions going forward. So we've done 2 of them so far, and you might think, well, that's not a big deal, but it's a way that we learned this from our visitors, who are often tweeting what is the hashtag for whatever the exhibition is. And even today we saw the importance of announcing something so that we're able to track it. So now we've printed that, and so you can imagine that that's not something that might have happened easily a couple of years ago, but now curators are on board and they understand the value of it.
I think one thing I want to add, so in the digital sphere, right, people for 10, 15 years have been trying to figure out how do we measure people's engagement with commercial websites, you know, right, there are different terms, and people understand that this engagement has to be measured in a more and more nuanced way. So I think when we're talking about like measuring the success of museums, sometimes we still use very, I would say, simplistic metrics, like how many people came to the exhibition, and I think digital has a promise, which may be realized or not, to actually allow us to think about it in more sophisticated ways, right? So when people come to a museum, what do we do, right? Like what happens? Does the exhibition change their life? I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think there's at least a promise that you know, we can move beyond this very simple metrics, where it's not about, where ultimately we'll begin to understand not the quantity, how many people came and how many minutes we spent, but the quality, right? Like what happened to them after we saw something. And we'll have to figure out how to do it, but I think it's a very interesting challenge.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that's sort of what I was getting at with the museum being based on the 20th century model of publishing, is that the measure of publishing success is how many people buy your book or the act of publishing it, not whether they actually enjoy it. And that this is the shift for museums, is to get away from the act of putting on the exhibition being the measure of success, or even that people came to it, that diverse audiences came and experienced it in particular ways. I'd also say that digital should be a term that we lose in about 5 years' time, if not sooner. Digital is physical. I mean, we're in a space where we don't separate the cell phone in our pocket from the rest of our lives. It's not something separate. You'll see with wearables as well that this is becoming normalized. That is really this, new normal that we're in now, and this is where there's this tension for museums, particularly as people feel. Certain people feel that digital is encroaching on their idea of a museum. A museum, the idea of the museum itself is always in flux, and it's negotiated with our publics. And I think it's about getting to the publics that are more representative in the case of a public museum, and keeping that the conversation up with those publics. The Brooklyn Museum is a fantastic example of that, of what they've done across a longer period of time now with their digital and physical projects, where like the Queen's Museum, have shifted the museum towards the publics that they care about, and have in fact been switching off some of their digital projects recently as a way of addressing the new needs that their audiences have, and the museum's response to those.
They've cut back on social media, for example.
Some particular social media, because that wasn't achieving the mission and goals of the organisation with their desired audiences.
I've been going to museums all my life, and even the Cooper-Hewitt. And one of one exhibition that I always wished to see and haven't yet, though it might be out there, was a room of 30 pictures. And one docent goes in and takes a look at each picture from the fashion point of view. And the next docent goes in and takes a look at each picture from the social point of view, and the next from the historical point of view, and the next, so that it's the same room, but it gets changed around 5 or 6 times just from the plane that's being looked at. Just wondered if who had been doing that?
In fact, I was just hearing at Museums on the Web last week about some UK museums that had done an initiative exactly like kind of that, where they'd have had different curatorial perspectives and visitor perspectives on the wall labels as well as on the digital experience. I'll try to remember what it is, and I'll tweet it. I'll have to search the internet.
I think the question that asks is which art is the most profound, and I think the answer to that is it's the museum itself.
Well, I'll just say very briefly. So I was trying to find the slides for today, but I couldn't find them because I saw them in 1970s when I was a teenager in some like Polish design magazine, but I knew that in the 60s and 70s people had very radical ideas about design architecture. And the slides which I was trying to find is somebody designed museum, probably late 60s, right? Where a museum would come to you, so it was some kind of whole museum was a giant kind of robot, and you kind of go over and dial up, and then these paintings would come. And we'll need to have this robot like this, I think, to fully implement your idea. But I'm also thinking about something more practical I saw in Barcelona around 2002, where it was an exhibition, and we said, there are 3 different ways you can go for exhibitions if you follow different arrows, right? So I think one lesson we learned from the media is you can create different configurations of the same objects, which I think what you were asking about. But this does involve physically moving people, right? People may be flying on drones around artworks, or artworks being flown on drone on you, and I'm not sure insurance would allow that. But I think conceptually we can still think about this. Yes? Okay, please.
You've been mentioning models where there's sort of an integrated model between curators and educators and technologists, and I've been quite impressed by the Stedelijk Museum, where it's quite often the same people who are working with the technology for marketing, and also they commission artists to use, for example, augmented reality. So I just wondered if you had any favourite models of your own where you thought that integration had managed to happen in a good way.
No, maybe Mona?
Yeah, maybe Mona. I mean, Mona,
We
the
always
example,
think everything we went Mona.
the example from
The Museum of Old and New Art, yeah.
The owner actually funded a startup with his own money to build the museum app that he wanted to serve that purpose of getting rid of the labels. I think for me though,
So just to be clear, were there was
no object labels.
Yeah,
he had a desire to not have labels in his museum at all. It was his museum, so he could. And he could afford it too, so anyway. But no, I think really the thing I think is important is that the museum in-houses as much experimentation as it can, because it's the museum that's got to change. It needs a relationship with the commercial creative world, of course, but it's not about helping the commercial creative world build new models to solve the challenges of the new economy.
It's
about
not? No. Why not?
It's about, well, it's also about the museum itself beginning to change. And I
wish the museum could help solve the problems of the new economy. I mean, it would be my dream that it could really have that kind of function. And maybe it could.
Well, maybe. Well, I'm thinking here of the BBC's model, where the BBC, BBC funded a huge amount of British software firms to make their educational websites.
Right.
But in fact, in some ways, the museums themselves need to build those muscles too. We need our own muscles to have the experimentation that we need.
Before I take the next question, which is probably should be the last, and you guys have been very good, so thank you. I want to say that, so there's a gallery right around the corner, which I think is closed now, but we have a very interesting exhibition. So it's a CUNY gallery, The Tale of Two Museums, which look at two very interesting experimental museums. One would be Museum of Jurassic Technology, and I think sometimes, right, the smaller museums can really reinvent their kind of cultural software, so to speak. So if you're passing by, during the daytime, please stop by. So this could be our final question.
Hi, you had talked previously about pushback against the technology. Have you had any problems and discussions on the idea of pushback from people who have the technology and the issue of understanding, well, even if we think we know what technology can do, but we can't really know that can be done tomorrow, or people who are used to so much photography out there, understanding that we have 22,000 objects or a million objects, and it'll take a little while before we get every object photographed and up online. And how do you respond to that type of issue?
Like people wanting too much too soon?
Yes.
Huh. That's probably more of a question for you guys.
I mean, I think the expectation of the public is that, such as, well, you had, Paola, about wanting that Mac when you first started. It's like, why doesn't the IT in my museum work like the IT at home or in my pocket? And these are organisational change issues, and I think why don't museums have beautiful Wi-Fi that's free and just works? These are things that take time, and transparency around those negotiations are important ways of building, public trust. I think transparency is probably the only way for public institutions to build relationships with their publics to help them to help the public realise that it is their museum and often also their money that makes these futures possible.
One of the things that we've done is to put Wi-Fi throughout the building, but we haven't done a good job of telling people we have it. And so you're going to see now signs that say free Wi-Fi. Another thing is Neil, who's wearing the glass. We've had people come in with glass and been stopped by guards who don't know what this is. And so helping them. So Neil's been doing demonstrations and trying to get people to understand that this won't they're not going to crash into the art. In fact, they're less likely to crash into the art because they're looking ahead instead of looking down at the iPhones. So that's an example of where the public and the museum might be in different places.
So before I close it off, I just want to make two final notes. One is, I apologize to all the wonderful people in the room who were not on the stage, people from all these museums and others who are equally qualified, but we kind of wanted to have some room for discussion, but thank you for coming, supporting us. And the second thing, I think that when you go to a museum next time, right, just think about the fact that what you're seeing is new media, right? Vermeer was using perhaps some optical devices, right, to create very photorealistic kind of this computer graphic like images of Delft. Obviously, Van Gogh was new media artist because he was using recently developed medium, which was invented by earlier French artists of oil paints in oil tubes. In fact, it's impossible to say what is the real color of Van Gogh paintings because Van Gogh was writing his letter, but he's using this very kind of raw paintings out of a tube, and he knows within a few years the color is going to mute, and that's why we look so offending to critics. So it's definitely like, it's almost like interactive art of Van Gogh. You actually don't know what the color is, right? So there's much more new media where, and I think everybody, the Vermeer and Van Gogh and all those people had to, fight for new things, and I think if everybody was afraid what other people were going to say, nothing would have happened. So as they say, on TV, let's just do it. Thank you guys so much for coming. See you soon.